for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics in July. Can you believe it's July? So excited to have you with us to hear some of our favorite authors talk about some of their favorite topics, a little bit about the research that goes on. Really excited to have you with us. I hope you enjoy listening wherever you like to get your podcasts, or perhaps if you haven't, give us a shot on YouTube. Also want to send a big thank you to my wonderful patrons who make Royals, Rebels, and Romantics possible. Now sit back and enjoy spending your summer with Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am delighted to be here with someone that I had the chance to meet in person when I was in the UK earlier this year. That's always such a treat for me to go and hear some of these authors that I'm so crazy about, to hear them speak and meet them in person. So I had a chance to meet Chris Laoutaris, and I'm sometimes a little trouble with your name, so I'm sorry about that, but I have
Well, that
learned it.
sounds really good to me. Yeah, that's spot on.
Well, I've learned it means lute player, so I think that's fabulous. But he is the author of this beautiful and substantive book, Shakespeare's book. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, agreeing to do that, signing my book, and meeting with me here to talk about Shakespeare's book. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol Ann. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you and with your listeners and audience. So thank you to everybody who's tuning in. Yeah, it was a joy to meet you at the event at Southwark Cathedral when I was talking about Shakespeare's book. And it's a delight to be doing this. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I'm thrilled. So I have a few questions. We're just going to sort of jump in and talk about this marvelous book and the phrase Shakespeare's book and what we think of Shakespeare's book. So you may know this is about the First Folio. So we hear that phrase a lot. What is the First Folio, and why is it considered one of the most important books? And that is true in the US too. When, immigrants came to the United States initially, they often brought a copy of the Bible and a copy of the First Folio. So what makes it so important, and what is it?
Yes, so the First Folio is otherwise entitled Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies. It's the first ever collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. It was published in 1623. So we've just finished the 400-year anniversary of the First Folio last year. Very busy year for us Shakespeare types. But the book, I mean, it cemented the importance of this book. I tend to think of it as one of the most important secular books of all time. Partly because of the huge cultural impact Shakespeare has had across the globe. So many cultures have made Shakespeare their own. What's significant about the First Folio as a volume is that it preserved not just the 36 Shakespeare plays that were published within it, but 18 of those plays were possibly preserved from oblivion. So 18 plays were published in the First Folio for the first time ever. These include plays like The Tempest, Twelfth Night, Antony and Cleopatra, The Winter's Tale, and Macbeth. So those plays may have been lost had it not been for this book. So, we may have heard of some other plays that haven't survived. For example, there was a play called Cardenio, we believe Shakespeare collaborated on, that may have survived just in a few tantalizing fragments. And another play you may have heard of, Love's Labour's Won, which hasn't survived. We know that play existed and it was by Shakespeare, but it hasn't survived. Why? Because this play, along with Cardenio, were not included in the First Folio. So we may have lost The Tempest, we may have lost Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and The Winter's Tale and Macbeth, had it not been for this book. So it has a tremendously kind of important place in the history of literary studies and the theatre because it preserved so much of Shakespeare's legacy.
I think it's hard to imagine for Shakespeareans like us, but also for people who often hear about these plays. It's hard to imagine a world without The Tempest or without Macbeth. I mean, these are really seminal plays throughout history. So that is really important to know, that this volume preserved those plays for us. So we can see immediately the power of this book now, but even in its time, it sort of changed bookmaking. It was really a pioneer in a way. So tell us why in its own time it was such an unusual and significant volume.
Yes, it was a kind of, from the get-go, this book was a kind of audacious and gutsy enterprise in many respects, and I'll explain why. So when we say a folio, what we mean is a large format book. So folios are made from taking very large sheets of paper and then folding them in half to give you the sides on which you print. So this creates a very large format book. But works in folio tended to be very elevated literary texts or works of religious or historiographical significance or huge kind of genealogical tomes. Um, so works published in folio format tended to be very expensive. These were expensive books. You needed space to read them. So, you can imagine this would have been in the household of somebody fairly wealthy with a desk and a room in which they had books and they had the space to read and enjoy these large folio format books, which were incredibly luxurious and weighty. So one thing you did not publish in folio format were commercial plays. So today we think of commercial plays as, playwriting as a kind of prestigious occupation. We value playwrights. In Shakespeare's day, the art of playwriting was in a kind of transitional phase. It still hadn't quite shaken off its connections to more artisanal occupations. So it was a less prestigious occupation, playwriting, at the time. So much so, in fact, that Sir Thomas Bodley, of what would become the famous Bodleian Library at Oxford University, refused to stock playbooks in his library. He referred to them as baggage books. And he also said they would, and I quote, bring disgrace to the library. So, he wanted nothing to do with playbooks. He thought they were rather low rent. He didn't want them in his library. But in 1616, Shakespeare's friend and you might say kind of competitor playwright Ben Jonson issued his own collected works in folio format, and that included commercial plays. So this was a scandalous thing to do at the time. Ben Jonson dared to include commercial plays, and I love this. One satirist quipped when he discovered this. He said, "Pray tell me, Ben, where doth the mystery lurk? What others call a play, you call a work." Now, the reason he said this was the term work, we use it interchangeably now, to mean kind of a text or a work, or it could be a play text or a novel. We might refer to it as a work. At the time, the term work was only reserved for elevated literary texts or important historical works or religious works. Kings published, collections called works. James I in 1616 published his collected works. And again, one thing he did not call a work was a play. And so Ben Jonson publishes this large folio format, very luxurious format. It includes commercial plays, and he refers to them as works. So this was a very daring, bold thing to do. But the First Folio took it one step further by only including commercial plays for the whole volume and referring to them as works more than once within the book. So again, the First Folio was a very audacious enterprise, publishing commercial plays in folio format and referring to them as works was still a new and gutsy thing to do at the time. So this was, by all accounts, a pioneering collection, and it did help in its own way to lend prestige to the craft of playwriting. So Shakespeare, in a very real way, was part of the journey of the art of writing plays to becoming a much more prestigious occupation than it was when Shakespeare started out as a young playwright.
Right. And it's interesting because the permanent theaters, that a building dedicated to hearing, as they would say, a play, that was new as well. And so this whole industry, if we might think of it that way, or this whole artistic endeavor was changing. And this was a real step in that, and an audacious, sort of scandalous step. So there you go. Now, there are a couple of people who are often credited with really bringing to life this First Folio. Hemmings and Condell, they were friends of Shakespeare. They are mentioned in his will. There's a monument to them in London I got to see. So why are they sort of highlighted, and why is that an incomplete story? The two of them did not work alone, even though that's sort of implied by these monuments and by the identification of them as bringing about the First Folio.
That's right. Yes. So you mentioned their monument, which is in St Aldermanbury in London. It's on the site of the church where Hemmings and Condell were buried. And there's splendid monument has a bust of Shakespeare on top and this wonderful dedication to Hemmings and Condell. And it says they alone created the First Folio. That's not quite true. That's kind of stretching the reality of things a bit. And I'll explain why that is. John Hemmings and Henry Condell were Shakespeare's friends and fellow actors in the playing company, known as first as the Chamberlain's Men, and then it became the King's Men when King James I himself took over as patron of the company. By the time the First Folio was printed, Hemmings and Condell had risen up the ranks of the playing company and become the kind of chief managers of that company. And so they had a senior position within it. And they did have a very important role in the creation of the First Folio. They would have been the individuals who gathered together Shakespeare's plays so that they could be printed in this very luxurious single volume format. But they were not the only individuals involved in the creation of the First Folio. So I did a podcast once where someone said to me, so what we learned from your book, Chris, is that it took a village to create the First Folio. And he was right. It did create, it needed a village to create the First Folio. So as well as Hemmings and Condell, backed by their playing company, the King's Men, there were 4 book-selling businesses involved in the creation of this volume because it was a very expensive book to put together. So it needed financial bankrolling. It needed backers who had the funds and the resources to create this volume. One of the most significant of these book-selling businesses was that owned by William and Isaac Jaggard. So they were a father and son printing team. And it was, in fact, in their own printing house in London's Barbican, in a shop called the Half Eagle and Key, in which the First Folio was physically created. It was physically put together in their printing house. So they were chief financial backers of the First Folio. There was also another publisher stationer named Edward Blunt. His name is spelt Blount, Blount, but we're reliably informed it was pronounced Blunt. There are lots of nice puns in the period, people writing to him saying, to be blunt with you, Mr. Blunt. So we know it was pronounced Blunt. He was another of the kind of key financiers of the First Folio. He also owned a shop from which he sold books. And then there were 2 junior members of the syndicate who helped finance the folio. These were William Astley and John Smethwick. So we have 4 book-selling businesses represented, financing the folio. In addition to them, we have a team of press workers who, in their own way, influenced the making of the First Folio, and I'm sure we'll get to talk a bit about them in our discussion. In addition to them, there were the patrons. So the First Folio was dedicated to 2 very wealthy and influential patrons. Their names were William Herbert and Philip Herbert. They were brothers. They were very influential. Just as a brief example, William Herbert was the patron to the painters Nicholas Hilliard, Marcus Geraerts the Younger, and Daniel Meitens, who were then kind of titans in the art scene as they still are today. They're still very well known. He was also the patron of the celebrated composer John Dowland, and also of many authors, including Ben Jonson. So these were very influential patrons. And in addition to them, we have the royal family and numerous political figures who, in their own way, thanks to the political climate, had a hand in influencing the First Folio in other ways. King James I was the patron of the playing company, the King's Men. So his beliefs, his political views could not help but shape the making of this book in some way. So it wasn't just Hemmings and Condell. We've got a huge kind of consortium of people involved in the making of this book. And in Shakespeare's book, I wanted to tell that full story and to do it in a linear way, because there has never been a book which tells the story of the making of the First Folio as it happened, as it unfolded, and how all of these figures were involved in its creation. So that was the task I set myself in writing this book.
Well, and you can see that whole village involved all levels of society. And it's important to imagine London at that time and what London looked like and was like, sort of the physical makeup of London and how did that influence the folio as well? Because it's almost like it couldn't have happened anywhere else. I mean, I tend to think it needed to be in London, right?
Absolutely, yeah, for so many reasons. And one thing I love about researching is trying to map an area, imagine what it was like. And I often do this in my books. I spend a lot of time working on mapping what kind of locations were connected to Shakespeare and who was living there and how they might have known each other and when they would have seen each other every day on the street, because where you lived, your proximity between locations and people had an impact on your career. It shaped what you did in your everyday life. And it's also true of the First Folio. So I mentioned that William and Isaac Jaggard had their printing shop in London's Barbican. Just south of that was one of the most important book-selling areas of London, and that was around St Paul's Cathedral. So in the yard of St Paul's Cathedral, particularly in the northeastern sector of St Paul's Cathedral's churchyard, there was an area for selling books, and it was the most important book-selling hub, you might say, in London. It was known as St Paul's Cross Churchyard. This was because in the centre of it, there was this large preaching cross, which was a stand where ministers could give kind of fire and brimstone sermons. And it was all very theatrical. It was a very theatrical space to be. And just opposite this giant kind of preaching stand, there was a shop known as the Black Bear. And that shop was owned by Edward Blunt, chief financial backer of the First Folio. Two doors down from him was another shop called the Parrot, and that shop was occupied by William Aspley, junior financier of the First Folio. So already you've got three members of the group of the First Folio kind of in very close proximity to each other. And then just west of St Paul's Cross Churchyard, there's an area known as St Dunstan's in the west. So this is overlooked by St Dunstan's Church, and around the perimeter of that church is another book-selling hub. So it's one of the other kind of important book-selling areas of London. It was in the kind of near the Inns of Court and where the legal profession was located. So it was an important area with lots of wealthy people with money to spend on opulent books. And just underneath the clock dial of St Dunstan's Church was the shop owned by John Smethwick. And in fact, on that same road, William and Isaac Jaggard had properties, and so did Henry Condell. So just paces away, you had all of these personalities kind of almost kind of probably bumping into each other every day on the street. So I just love the fact that this folio might have come about through these very human interactions, people living cheek by jowl in London, close to each other, seeing each other every day, possibly attending the same churches, shopping in the same shops. So I just love that the way the makeup of London shaped this book. And so there's a lot of that in my book, who lived where and what other individuals connected with the Shakespeare industry were close by and how that shaped the development of the First Folio itself.
Right. We forget sometimes these are people who are going shopping and eating and looking for things and wandering around, and they would bump into each other. And that idea of taking a village, it's all kind of right there.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's just exciting to think about and imagine, being back there. And I love that in the book that we can sort of almost imagine ourselves back there because we know where St. Paul's is. We know where some of these things are, and we can pace it out in close proximity. Now, speaking of the people who were involved in sort of the village of Shakespeare, he's gone by this time, but before then, he had worked with a great actor, Burbage, and he was very important in the company. And some of these parts were really written with him in mind. Shakespeare knew who was going to be acting in these key parts. So Burbage died, I want to get the year right, in 1619. And that also had an impact on the folio. So talk to us about Burbage and why he had such an important part in the folio story.
Yes, absolutely. I think Richard Burbage's death and its impact has been largely overlooked. So the more I researched this, the more significant I felt it was. Richard Burbage, as you mentioned, was the star actor of the King's Men playing company. Shakespeare wrote such incredible roles for him, including Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, Richard III. These were highly celebrated roles in Shakespeare's day, um, thanks not only to Shakespeare's talent as a playwright, but to Burbage's ability to bring these characters to life. And so he was a much loved figure. And in March of 1619, he died. So this is 4 years before the printing of the First Folio. And in fact, he died about 2 weeks after the death of Queen Anne of Denmark, James I's wife. And it became kind of a notorious thing that uh, Burbage's death was more mourned than the Queen's. For example, one elegist said, Dick Burbage was their mortal god on earth. When he expires, lo, all lament the man. But where's the grief should follow good Queen Anne? So everybody was busy mourning Burbage. It was this kind of unprecedented outpouring of grief. It was almost like somebody, put a kind of a mourning cloth all over London. It was it was so felt because if you imagine tens of thousands of people had seen Burbage in these incredible roles, and everybody felt they owned a piece of him. But in fact, Burbage died within days of another senior actor named Richard Cowley, sometimes pronounced Cooley. And Burbage was on his deathbed dictating his own will on the very day that Richard Cowley was buried. So it must have been a really strange thing for Hemmings and Condell. They would probably have been going back and forth between the funeral, comforting Richard Cooley's family, and back to Burbage's bedside to comfort him during his final hours. So it must have been such a traumatic period for them. But I think what's significant is when I sat down and did the calculations, I realized something I hadn't thought about before, which was that at that point, as they were losing both Richard Cowley and Richard Burbage, Hemmings and Condell became the last two surviving senior members of the playing company who were the original sharers when the Chamberlain's Men was created. And so it must have dawned on them that this is a now or never moment. Soon, if anything happened to them, there will be nobody who knew the totality of Shakespeare's career from start to finish, the way Hemmings and Condell did. They knew Shakespeare's preferences, they knew the different versions of his plays, they would have known at least some of the people, the rights to some of those plays had been sold on to. And I think they must have realized that a project to commemorate Shakespeare in a book, large book format, would have not been possible without them. So I'm thinking this may have been a now or never moment for them. And also, if you think about the impact of Burbage's death, suddenly everybody remembered how great Shakespeare was because they were remembering Burbage's greatest roles and thinking, well, so many of those roles were written by Shakespeare. And so it's almost as if everybody suddenly wakes up again to the importance of Shakespeare and this collaboration, Shakespeare and Burbage. And so I think that would have also fed a public appetite for Shakespeare's works, which Hemmings and Condell would have realised. And so I do think Burbage's death would have had a huge impact on Hemmings and Condell. And initially, it may have delayed the publication of the First Folio because there would have been an adjustment in the company, having lost their star actor, having to put somebody else in that role. But then I think thereafter it may have spurred on its creation as a memorial to Shakespeare and this great partnership between Burbage and Shakespeare.
Well, and people, like you say, remembering those great parts, having seen them and knowing they were Shakespeare's creations. So now something else happens that same year that's a really interesting piece of the story, and it's the appearance of what's sometimes called the false folio or the Pavia Quarto. I and I mentioned this to you. I worked and was a volunteer, and now I'm a reader at Folger Shakespeare Library. And that particular edition, the Pavia Quarto or False Folio, is important to the Folger collection. So tell us about that. It's 1619. It's that same year, and something is produced, but it's not quite right. So what's the problem there?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, so the what we call the Pavia Quartos or the False Folio, this is a really mysterious episode in Shakespeare history. So although we call it the False Folio sometimes, it was actually not a folio book. It was a series of plays in a smaller format known as a quarto, which is why we call them the Pavia Quartos sometimes. This is after Thomas Pavia, who was one of the publishers who financed this collection. and it appears to have been an earlier, somewhat aborted attempt at creating a kind of Shakespeare collection. But what's peculiar about it is, or among a number of peculiar things about it, is it was also printed by William and Isaac Jaggard, who printed the First Folio. So that's mystery number one. What is the connection between this strange early attempt to create a Shakespeare collection and the First Folio, given that both were printed by William and Isaac Jaggard in the same print shop in London's Barbican? So that's a mystery in itself. But then there are other oddities about this False Folio. Among the plays it includes, which are genuine Shakespeare plays like King Lear, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, there are also plays attributed to Shakespeare which are not by him. So one of them is a play on the life of about the life of Sir John Oldcastle, which was not written by Shakespeare. It was produced by a rival playing company. And then there's another play called A Yorkshire Tragedy, which is attributed to Shakespeare in the False Folio. But that isn't the only reason why this collection is weird. What's particularly strange about it is it has on its title pages false dates and false imprints. So that's a very strange thing in itself, that this peculiar collection was designed to deceive. So these dates, some of the dates on this collection are false. So it's a big mystery. What is this collection? What connection does it have to the First Folio? So I present a number of different theories in my book. One of my theories is that the collection was actually sparked by Burbage's death. So it was a kind of attempt to rush out a collection to capture this kind of wellspring of grief over Burbage by reminding everybody how great his collaboration with Shakespeare was. So that's one theory I have. So it's possible that Burbage's death sparked this False Folio, but it looks like there was some kind of agreement between the makers of the False Folio and possibly agents connected to what would become the First Folio. The agreement being that they stop printing this False Folio and make it look not like a single collection, which was the original intention, but to make it look like a series of old remaindered plays, which would be no competition for a brand spanking new First Folio that was soon to come out. So it looks as if there was some wheeler dealing going on behind the scenes involving the Jaggards, who then went on to create the First Folio on the agreement that they make the False Folio just look like old plays that just happened to be knocking around some bookshops. So there was a great deal of subterfuge, but I think that subterfuge must have been to deceive the book buying public, rather than the King's men, who must have known about it. They wouldn't have been fooled, I don't think, by this collection.
Well, it's just so interesting because that's one of the things. There are several obstacles to even getting to the point of the First Folio being undertaken and starting the printing, and that's one of them. That there were other things, there were other copies of the plays, the quartos, the individual quartos, but not of every play. And so what are some of the obstacles even before printing could start? We know the money is always an obstacle, but what are some of the other obstacles even before the printing could start? Because there are plenty of obstacles once the printing started. But
Absolutely, yeah.
why
It's a
was it
drama
so
in itself.
tough? Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it was. There were so many obstacles they had to overcome before they even started printing. And as you rightly mentioned, one of these is that some of the plays that Shakespeare wrote, the printing rights for which no longer belong to the playing company. So just to explain how this works, today we have a sense of copyright ownership. So as an author, I feel that my work is copyrighted to me. It's my intellectual property. It was not so for Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's plays did not belong to him. They belonged to the company to which he belonged. So they were a collective asset. So they were jointly owned by the sharers of the playing company. But during the first half of Shakespeare's career, the company seems to have allowed or even sold on many of Shakespeare's plays to publishers, giving those publishers the right to publish them. Now, what that meant was the playing company lost the right to print those works. It retained the right to perform them, but not to kind of resell them on to be printed by other publishers. So this meant that around half of Shakespeare's output was out there in the world with other stationers, publishers, printers who were holding on to those rights. So before those plays could be printed, those copyright holders had to be tracked down and negotiated with, permission granted and paid for so that they could be included in the First Folio. So that was a monumental job in itself. And in fact, the task was to print the First Folio, the rights to up to 22 plays belonging to up to 14 individual rights holders had to be determined. So that was no easy task. Now, they were helped along in this endeavor because the syndicate who produced the First Folio, these 4 book-selling businesses, between them already owned the rights to 8 Shakespeare plays. So that was helpful. They had those rights in the bag. The playing company itself managed to retain the rights to 14 Shakespeare plays. So they just transferred the rights for those plays to the printers. But this still left a kind of sizable number of plays that they had to negotiate rights over. So, this left approximately 14 plays and 8 rights holders with whom they had to negotiate over those 14 plays. So that was a monumental task in itself, huge amount of work to track those rights holders down. And we know that some of those rights holders were a bit difficult. We know that some of them didn't want to part with their rights easily, and this led to delays with the printing. It led to the printing team having to find creative ways of working around those plays that were not yet negotiated for, because they started printing before they completely tied down all the rights. So we know that caused a lot of problems. The other problem, as you mentioned, was the cost. So this was an incredibly expensive book. One estimate for the cost of creating each individual First Folio is 6 shillings 8 pence, which works out for what we think might have been a print run of 750 copies initially. It works out at a total outlay of £250, which doesn't sound like a lot, but today that's over £33,000. And just to put that in perspective, if you were in a good artisanal profession like goldsmithing or shoemaking, you could be expecting to make £4 or £5 a year, which was considered a good salary. So £4 or £5, good salary, but the cost of the outlay for the First Folio was £250. It's colossal. The paper stocks alone cost over £81. That's more than £11,000 because this paper to make the First Folio was imported from France. So this was good quality paper. So all of this amounted to making the First Folio the most expensive book of English plays ever produced up to that point in history. So it cost approximately 15 shillings to buy a First Folio. So that's roughly £120 today, but that doesn't really cover the purchasing power of £120 at that time. So the First Folio was such an expensive endeavor, which is why it needed these 4 book-selling businesses to bankroll it. But it was just another of the obstacles, the huge obstacles they had to face in order to make this book. So no wonder it took 2 years to print. So they
Right.
started in February 1622. They didn't finish printing till around November 1623. So it's nearly 2 full years.
Well, and the idea of ongoing negotiations with previous printers of quartos, one of the stories I love about the folio is if you look at the what we would now call a table of contents, the catalog of the folio, not all the plays that end up in the folio are on that catalog because the early pages, and we'll talk about printing in one sec, the early pages were printed first and they weren't reprinted to add the play they finally got permission to include. So little
Yes,
things like that. I think
absolutely.
the book itself has so many stories.
Yeah, that was
So
Troilus and Cressida,
yeah,
which,
Crows and Cressida.
the rights to that were owned by a man named Henry Worley. He was just not giving up the rights easily. So they finished the book and started selling it and then negotiated the rights and then added the play without adding it to the contents
Like,
page, which I loved. So yeah,
it's fabulous. I mean, these are the kinds of stories that really it was such a living project at the time in a way that we don't think of books. Books are so different today.
Mhm.
But one of the things I love is to talk about the actual printing of the First Folio. And you really, in your book, take us into those print shops. And again, printing has become so easy for us today. We can do it at home. But in those days, the compositors and each one setting the type in little type sticks and having to do it backwards. And the folio in, a folio meant that it's printed in quires and it's in sixes and all of that. So can you just explain to us the arduous process of printing a folio?
Yeah, it was such, I mean, it must have been such a fiendishly difficult thing to do. So you have these press workers called compositors, and as you mentioned, their job was to take the thousands of tiny pieces of lead type, put them into frames so that the printing could be done. But in order for the printing to come out the right way round, they had to print, they had to, they had to insert these pieces of lead type into frames backwards and upside down, so they were a mirror image. So you can see how many mistakes must have been made in that process. But what they had in front of them, I don't know how on earth they did it. They had about 150 different cases in front of them, which contained these pieces of lead type, letters, punctuation marks, spacing, all of that. One detail I love is that the upper cases had the capital letters and the lower cases had the smaller letters.
Mhm.
And today, when we talk about capital letters, we still talk about uppercase and then smaller letters being lowercase. And that's where it comes from.
Right.
Uppercase letters with the capital letters and lowercase with the smaller letters. So you have these 150 cases in front of you and you have to pick out these tiny pieces of type in order to print the pages. But before that even happens, there's a process called casting off, which basically means that if you're printing in this format, which, as you say, is, we call it a folio in sixes because each section of the folio is made up of 3 large sheets of paper which are folded in half and then sewn down the middle, and that creates 6 sides to print on. Or rather 6 leaves to print on, which are 12 sides. And so in order for that to work, you have to know what's going to go on each page before you start printing. So you have these dedicated experts whose job it is to figure out from the copy text being the the copy of the text that you're printing from, whether that's a manuscript or an earlier version, say, of the play. So you have to figure out which sections of the copy text are going to go on which sections of this kind of bundles of 6 pages. So incredibly difficult, but then that led to all sorts of problems. So sometimes compositors would get to the end of a section and realize they had finished too quickly and so had lots of space left. But that was quite easy to deal with. If you had lots of space left, if the casting off process wasn't estimated correctly and you had lots of space, you could fill it with decorative borders, you could space out the text, you could put decorative wood blocks that looked quite pretty at the end of the page, so there was no awkward kind of spaces. Or you could add a cast list. So some plays in the First Folio where you see a long list of a cast of characters, and we do see this in a couple of plays in the First Folio, it's because they had too much space left. So they needed something to fill it with. So they thought, what should we add? Okay, let's add a list of characters just to fill the space. So that was fairly easy to deal with. The problems really began when you ran out of space. So if you were getting to the end of a page and you thought, oh, crikey, I can't fit all the text in, what do you do? And so these compositors had quite a bit of leeway to make decisions. We know from other texts that compositors were valued for their ability to understand the text, to make reasoned decisions as to what they thought would work, and to almost ingest the spirit of the author to kind of figure out what the author may have liked. And so the compositors have a bit more autonomy than we tend to think. And so if you ran out of space, you had a number of options. You might remove stage directions. You might use more contractions and shrink the text down. You might even remove whole lines. You could turn verse into prose to squash the text together. And so there are a number of techniques that were used, but of course, this changed Shakespeare's words. So sometimes what we think of as Shakespeare's words are the compositor's words, or the compositor's decisions, at least. And part of the process for some of those plays, which may have changed them, was having good copy. That is, a good copy of the Shakespeare plays that you're printing. And we know, in fact, that some of the first few Shakespeare plays were copied neatly by a scribe named Ralph Crane. And Ralph Crane also changed Shakespeare's words. He had all sorts of weird quirks. He loved parentheses and bracketed phrasing, so he used lots of bracketed phrasing, much more than Shakespeare did. Um, he loved compound words. The more complicated, the better. So, for example, the phrase "be mocked at stabs," all connected with hyphens, which we see in The Tempest, was probably Ralph Crane's invention rather than Shakespeare's. So we tend to think of Shakespeare as loving compound words, but some of those compound words may have been Ralph Crane's. And Ralph Crane also loved elaborate stage directions, which told us something about the emotional states of the characters, which was not actually a Shakespearean thing to do. Um, so this changed Shakespeare's words, but it also influenced generations and generations of actors and interpreters, who were using these bracketed phrasings to breathe through and phrase Shakespeare's words, were being influenced by those elaborate stage directions, and were being our conceptions, I guess, of Shakespeare's love of compound words were also being compounded, if you like, to coin a phrase, by Ralph Crane. So what we sometimes think of as Shakespeareisms are probably Ralph Cranianisms. So printing process was complicated, it was difficult, but it also led to ways in which Shakespeare's words were changed, and that left its imprint almost literally on Shakespeare's legacy.
Right. And different compositors also had different ways of spelling words, even simple words like go, some spelled G-O and some spelled G-O-E. And so one of the fascinating things is, and I know this is a big part of the Folger story, and the reason the Folgers kept collecting First Folios is because they don't all, even though they all came out in this one year, in this one print run, they are not all the same. Each copy is not all the same. In fact, one of the scholars we had come to the Folger said he believes that each copy has at least one difference, so that no two are the same. But all of these things really help us understand what was going on in the print shop, or what was going on with different people who were going over the text or working on it. And it's just such an amazing way to think about this book, that brings us Shakespeare in all kinds of different ways, other people's hands all over those words.
Absolutely, yeah. No two copies would be identical. They had a process called stop press corrections. So
Mm-hmm.
when mistakes were being made as the printing was going on, they would correct them while it was happening. So that meant that those pages were not thrown away; they were put back into the folio. So some of those folios would have had those errors. Some would have had them corrected, and that would have been an ongoing process. So no two folios would have been alike.
Right. And it's just an amazing way to think about this book as this evolving and really layered, all the layered meanings. So, excuse me.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons, I guess, why the tree is on the cover, because the folio is and this evolving organic thing, like this tree with its kind of growing in different directions and branching out in different ways. So yeah, the tree seemed
Yeah,
a very good metaphor for the
very, yeah,
folio.
great. Now, there are a couple of people who've been sort of on the sidelines, but I wanted to get your take, and from the book, your take on how Anne and William Shakespeare, those two important
Mm.
people, were involved in the creation of the First Folio.
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, and I loved thinking about this. Because Anne Shakespeare died just months before the first folio was printed. And I did often wonder, and I know many people have wondered, did Anne Shakespeare have anything to do with the first folio, with the transmission of Shakespeare's legacy? Should we give her some credit for that? And Germaine Greer, in her book on Shakespeare's wife, says maybe we should be thinking more seriously about this issue. And so I had a really unique opportunity when creating this book, because what I did for the first time was I put the printing of the first folio in chronological sequence, and I overlaid that with what these different characters were doing, so I was able to chart what Hemmings and Condell and the other players in the King's Men were doing while the first folio was being printed. And I noticed two, I think, quite significant things, or at least interesting things. In the summer of 1622, the printing of the first folio was ground to a halt. So all the printing on the first folio stopped. What was happening in that summer, I thought? So doing my digging, my research, I found that the Hemmings and Condell and the King's Men were in Stratford upon Avon during that summer, which was very interesting. So the First Folio
Mhm.
grinds to a halt. King's
Mhm.
Men pitch up in Stratford upon Avon, where famously they were paid not to perform, which is a detail I love. There was a long-standing prohibition against playing in the Guildhall, and so they were forbidden from playing, but they were paid not to perform, which is it's got to be a first. So what were they doing in Stratford upon Avon? I did wonder, and we can only speculate, were they there looking for copies of Shakespeare's plays? So at this point in the printing of the First Folio, summer 1622, there were plenty of plays for which good quality copy was required. So possibly they were there looking for um, texts to use for the printing of the First Folio. They must have, paid their respects at Shakespeare's grave, and I do wonder if that influenced the title page of Shakespeare's First Folio. Shakespeare's title page portrait in the First Folio looks so much like his funerary bust in Holy Trinity Church, Stratford upon Avon. So is that what happened? Were they there and they saw Shakespeare's monument and they thought, yes, this is what we want for the front cover of the First Folio, in effect, with its striking, almost funereal-like portrait of Shakespeare? So that's possible. They may have acquainted Anne Shakespeare with their plans to commemorate Shakespeare in this folio. The other thing I noticed, which for me was even more poignant, was Anne Shakespeare died on the 6th of August, 1623. So I was able to collate that with the printing of the First Folio, and I found that that was precisely when Othello was being printed. So it's amazing that we now know what play was being printed when Anne Shakespeare died. But what I think is more significant here is one of the first plays the company performs in its first court season after Anne Shakespeare's death is The Winter's Tale. Now, the performance text of that play had gone missing. We don't know how long it was missing, but what we do know is Hemmings and Condell and the rest of the King's Men's Playing Company relicensed that play for performance just under 2 weeks after Anne Shakespeare's death. And so this made me think, was there a correlation? Did Anne Shakespeare's death make them want to play The Winter's Tale as a sort of commemoration to her? This is a play about monumentalized maternity and femininity. You've got a character named Hermione who's believed to have died. Her statue, her funerary statue, is unveiled at the end and it comes back to life almost miraculously. And Hermione has a son named Mamilius in the play who tragically doesn't get revived. He doesn't come back to life. And so did The Winter's Tale always remind Shakespeare and Anne of their son Hamnet, who died tragically young? And did Hermione remind Hemmings and Condell of Anne Shakespeare? Did this play really mean something to them, and did they want to perform it for Anne? And if that's true, then it means that Anne Shakespeare continued to be special, to mean something to those who created the First Folio, which is a lovely thought. And so we can't prove anything conclusively, but these are tantalizing fragments, glimpses into that world that we can see once we overlay everything in a kind of chronological sequence.
Right. And that is such a new way of thinking about those final months, both of her life and the creation of the folio. And then what about Shakespeare himself?
Good question. So that's the
That's the
million dollar
big
question that
question,
everybody, yeah,
right?
did Shakespeare have a hand in his own book?
Yeah.
We get again tantalizing suggestions. So in the First Folio's preliminary pages, Hemmings and Condell tell us that Shakespeare would have overseen the publication of his First Folio had he not been prevented by death, which is really interesting. So they say it was his right to do that. And Shakespeare would have known that Ben Jonson was overseeing the creation of his own collected work. So why wouldn't he want to do the same? So it seems logical. We also know that Shakespeare left money for mourning rings to three of his London associates, Hemmings, Condell, and Burbage. We know Burbage dies in 1619. Hemmings and Condell live on to help create the First Folio. So had Burbage lived and signed his name beside those of Hemmings and Condell in the First Folio, that might have suggested that the gift of those mourning rings was a kind of pact. It was a kind of bond that they would continue his legacy and oversee the publication of his works after his death. So that's a lovely thought, that maybe that he, on his deathbed, literally, he kind of initiated that bond. But what I come up with a number of other ways of answering that question in the book. One of which is I noticed something about most of the figures who commemorated Shakespeare in the First Folio. So the preliminary pages to the First Folio are tremendously important. You know, they're just 11 pages in length, but they really give us brand Shakespeare. So brand Bard begins with the preliminary pages. And in fact, it gathered together the most that had ever been written about Shakespeare in any one place up until that point. So the First Folio is a beginning point for Shakespeare biography, if you like. So it's tremendously important for Shakespeare's image. And I noticed that many of those who wrote commemorative poems for Shakespeare in the First Folio were attached to Oxford University. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that means something. And it had bothered me for so long. So the more research I did, the more connections I found between this coterie of commemorators for Shakespeare and Oxford University. Almost everybody attached to those preliminaries was connected to it in some way. And that includes the patrons, it includes the poets. Even Hemming's son went to Oxford University, and he appears to have been cultivated ties with Oxford. And so what's the connection? I thought there must be some kind of link. Now, the breakthrough came in a book by Lena Cohen Orlin called The Private Life of William Shakespeare. And in that book, she had done some incredible research on Shakespeare's funerary monument and found that the design of Shakespeare's funerary monument was only seen in attached to figures connected with Oxford University, Oxford scholars and Oxford ministers. So that was the missing link for me. So I thought, aha, light bulb moment. This funerary monument of Shakespeare's appears to be telling the world that we should be looking at Shakespeare as a kind of Oxford Don. And in fact, if you look closely at Shakespeare's funerary bust, his mouth is slightly open. You can see his teeth. So he's leaning on a preaching cushion, as Lena Cohen Orlin found. And these preaching cushions were used by, lecturers and preachers. So Shakespeare's presented like an Oxford Don or preacher in the act of preaching or speaking, which is really interesting. So then that got me thinking about the First Folio. So I think they speak the same language. I think those who put together the First Folio realized what Shakespeare wanted. And what Shakespeare wanted was to be seen as this kind of Oxford Don, someone who had made it. He didn't go to university, but he had managed to climb up the ranks and to be part of a kind of literary intelligentsia, many of whose associates were attached to Oxford. So I found some tantalizing evidence that those who wrote these commemorative poems were indeed probably Shakespeare's friends. They're attached to Oxford University, and it was Shakespeare himself who communicated his desire to be presented in this way. And so in that sense, the First Folio bears the indelible imprint of Shakespeare. The Shakespeare wanted to communicate and show to the world. And so that's a different way of answering the question, did Shakespeare have a hand in his own book? But I think we might be seeing in the First Folio vestiges of Shakespeare's own will in his book.
Well, that's wonderful. And that's one of the great ways to think this way, that it really is Shakespeare's book, right? I mean, it was actually his. So that is a wonderful way to answer that question. And I do really appreciate your spending all this time with us to take us through what is this remarkable journey that involves a village of people. And I would say, I'm pretty convinced, includes Anne Shakespeare and William Shakespeare, as well as all of these other people. And this book, the First Folio, as we call it, really does change the world. I mean, it changes the English language, it changes plays and playwrights and all of that. And I think as we continue to learn from Shakespeare and watch and participate in these plays, it continues to change us. So I think this book is absolutely that you point out in your book, such a lasting tool, not of an age, but for all time. And you are part of helping us understand that. So thank you, Chris,
It's a
so
total pleasure.
much.
Yeah.
This has
No,
been
thank you. Thank
wonderful.
you for inviting me. It's been a total joy.
Well, so fun and so much research. And I love hearing you talk about your research because it's clear from reading it that your book as well must have taken a really long time
Yeah,
to put
took 10
together.
years.
Yes,
Yeah,
a
the
really
First
long time.
Folio only took 2 years to print.
Yeah.
That's nothing. You know, mine took 10
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. Right. Because discovering how it really happened and adding that chronological framework that we have missed in the past that opens so many windows into the time and the people involved. So thank you so much for your work. Thank you for all of your work. And thank you for coming on. Now tell us, where can we follow you? What are you working on now? What are you doing these days?
You could find me on Twitter, or X as it's now known, at Dr. C. Laoutaris, all in one word. So that's my tag on Twitter. And you can also find me on the Shakespeare Institute website. So I'm based at the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford upon Avon. I've got a kind of web page as a staff member at the Shakespeare Institute. And now I'm working on another biography, not related to Shakespeare. Interestingly, it's related to Sir Robert Cecil. So I'm writing
Oh,
the
wow.
story of Sir Robert Cecil, who was the most powerful man in England during 2 royal reigns. He was Secretary of State under Queen Elizabeth I and James I. And some people believe, and there is a Shakespeare connection, that he inspired Shakespeare's Richard III. So I'm kind of researching that to find out whether that's true. What connections are there between Shakespeare's Richard III and Sir Robert Cecil? But he's such a fascinating and enigmatic figure. He
Yes.
does have some Shakespeare connections that I am kind of exploring.
Oh, that's wonderful. So there's still some Shakespeare in there. Well, that is
Yes,
wonderful. And if you get a chance to go to the UK and go to Stratford, which is just so marvelous, do so. And Chris does give talks, and some of them end up online as well if you don't happen to be in the UK, as lucky as I was to be there while he was speaking. So thank you again for being with us. It has been just a treat. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this wonderful discussion about Shakespeare's book.
Thank you so much indeed. And thanks to all of your listeners and everyone watching. I really appreciate you tuning in. And thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute treat.
So much fun. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Could I please ask a favor? Would you mind leaving a rating, maybe making a comment, subscribing, checking us out on YouTube, subscribing there? We really appreciate your support, and you are the reason we keep doing these episodes and the thing that keeps us going. Thank you so much for coming to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics.